6 months ago she could not afford bread. Tonight she wore sapphires worth more than the house her former husband had banished her from, and the man who put them there was watching her from across the hall like she was the only woman in England. She had nothing. He had everything. Society said they could never be equals, but when a duke decides he wants something, or someone, there is no force in England powerful enough to stop him. Welcome back to Aristocratic Hearts. I have been waiting to share this story with you. Tell me, where are you listening from tonight? Whether you are curled up in bed, on your morning commute, or taking a break from the chaos of life, I want to know. Drop your city and your local time in the comments. I read every single one, and I love seeing this community span the globe. Tonight's story is set in 1847 England. It is about a woman named Winsome Leith, a name that means joyful, though joy had long since abandoned her life. For 5 years, she was married to a man who blamed her for the one thing she could not control. He called her barren in drawing rooms. He called her cursed at dinner tables. He called her worthless in the privacy of their bedchamber, where no one could hear her weep. And then, when he had broken her thoroughly enough, he cast her out with nothing but the clothes on her back and the remnants of a reputation that society had already torn to shreds. But here is the part they did not expect. Here is the part that no one, not her former husband, not his sneering mother, not the wagging tongues of Bath society, could have predicted. She was never the problem. And when the most powerful duke in the west of England found her selling lace in a village market with calluses on her fingers and shadows beneath her eyes, he did not see a broken woman. He saw the only woman he had ever wanted, and he had been watching her quietly, patiently, obsessively, for longer than she could possibly know. Let me take you to the autumn of 1847, to a world of candle-lit ballrooms and whispered secrets, where a woman's worth was measured in the children she bore and the silence she kept, and where one woman's refusal to stay silent would burn an entire wedding to the ground. The trouble began, as trouble so often does, with a man's pride. Sir Aldric Poole was not a duke. He was not even an earl. He was a baronet, the lowest rung of the hereditary ladder. But he carried himself as though the crown itself had been offered, and he had graciously declined. He was the sort of man who measured his worth by the width of his cravat and the height of his ambitions, and both were considerable. At 33, he possessed a country house in Wiltshire that leaked when it rained, an income of £900 a year that he spent as though it were 9,000, and a desperate gnawing hunger for a son. It was this hunger that had driven him to marry Winsome Leith 6 years earlier. She had been 19 then, the daughter of a country vicar with no fortune, no connections, and no dowry worth mentioning. What she had was a face that stopped men in doorways, dark hair that caught the light like polished wood, eyes the colour of winter honey, warm and watchful, and a quietness about her that Aldric had mistaken for submission. He had proposed within a fortnight of their introduction at a parish assembly. Her father, delighted that any man of title had shown interest, had encouraged the match. Winsome herself had felt the stirring of something she believed was love, or at least its cousin, hope. Aldric was handsome in those early days, attentive. He brought her wildflowers from the hedgerows and read poetry to her in the garden while the bees droned in the lavender. She did not know yet that his attentiveness was inventory, that he was cataloguing her wide hips, her healthy colour, her youth. All the signs, he believed, of a woman who would bear sons easily and often. Now, it is important to understand what marriage meant for a woman in 1847 England. Under the doctrine of coverture, a wife's legal identity was absorbed entirely into her husband's. She could not own property. She could not sign contracts. She could not keep her own earnings if she had any. Even her children, should she be fortunate enough to bear them, belonged to her husband in the eyes of the law. When Winsome spoke her vows at the altar of St. Michael's in Aldric's parish, she did not merely gain a husband. She surrendered every legal right she possessed. She became, in the eyes of English law, invisible. The first year passed without a child. Aldric was patient. "These things take time," he told her, though his jaw was tight when he said it. The second year passed. His patience frayed. He began making remarks at breakfast, pointed comments about his friend Bancroft's wife, who had produced twins within 10 months of the wedding, about his cousin's bride, already expecting her third. By the third year, the remarks had sharpened into accusations. He stopped touching her with tenderness and began touching her with purpose, as though she were a piece of machinery that required more forceful operation. Afterward, he would turn away from her in bed without a word, and she would lie in the darkness, listening to the clock and wondering what she had done wrong. By the 4th year, his mother had arrived, Mrs. Honoria Poole, and let it be said plainly that no woman in the history of Wiltshire had ever been less aptly named, installed herself in the East Wing and made it her mission to remind Winsome daily that she was failing in the single duty for which she had been acquired. "You look thin," she would say over tea, her eyes raking Winsome's figure. "Men need women with substance. Perhaps that is why your womb is empty. There's nothing for a child to hold on to." Or, "My son could have married the Beckett girl, you know. 3 children already. 3. And she has a squint." Or, worst of all, said with a smile that never reached her eyes, "I do wonder, my dear, whether there is something fundamentally wrong with you, whether God, in his wisdom, has simply decided that you are not fit to be a mother. Some women are not. It is a pity, but there it is." Winsome endured this for 5 years, 5 years of monthly hope followed by monthly devastation, 5 years of Aldric's growing coldness, his mother's cruelty, the whispers of the servants who pitied her and the neighbours who gossiped about her, 5 years of lying alone in a bed that felt like a coffin, pressing her face into the pillow so that no one would hear her cry. She begged Aldric to see a physician, not for herself. She had been examined 3 times, each time declared healthy, each time told that there was no observable reason she should not conceive. She begged him to submit to examination himself. Perhaps the difficulty lay with him. Perhaps together they might find an answer. His response was immediate and volcanic. "Are you suggesting," he said, his voice dropping to a register that made the candle flames shiver, "that I am less than a man? That the fault lies with me?" "No," she said quickly. "I only thought—" "You thought wrong." His eyes were ice. "The physicians have examined you. They have found nothing, which means the problem is beyond medicine. It is in your nature, your blood, your constitution, and I will not stand before a doctor and be told that my wife's deficiency is somehow mine." He left the room. She heard the front door slam, then the clatter of hooves as he rode out into the night. He did not return for 3 days. When he did return, he brought a solicitor. Now, in 1847 England, divorce was not a simple matter. It was not a document signed and filed. It was a catastrophe. A full divorce, one that permitted remarriage, required a private Act of Parliament. It demanded proof of adultery, usually on the wife's part, and even then it was granted only to men. A woman could not divorce her husband under any circumstances. The process was ruinously expensive, staggeringly public, and socially devastating for everyone involved, but most especially for the wife, who emerged from the proceedings stripped of name, reputation, and any claim to the life she had known. Aldric did not pursue a full parliamentary divorce. He lacked the grounds. Winsome had been painfully, devastatingly faithful. And he lacked the funds. What he pursued instead was a judicial separation through the ecclesiastical courts, which would dissolve the marriage in all but the strictest legal sense. She would be cast out. She would receive no maintenance. She would retain nothing. He announced this to her on a Tuesday evening over a supper of cold mutton and boiled turnips, as though he were discussing the weather. "I have instructed Mr. Crawley to begin proceedings," he said, cutting his meat with precision. "You will be out of this house by the end of the month. I will provide you with £5 and a trunk for your personal effects. Anything of value remains with me." Winsome set down her fork. The room seemed to contract around her, the walls pressing inward, the candlelight dimming. £5, she repeated. £5, he confirmed. More than generous, given the circumstances. Given what circumstances? He looked up at her then, and his expression was the thing that broke her. Not anger, not cruelty, but boredom. The flat, disinterested gaze of a man returning a purchase that had not performed as advertised. "Given that you have failed, Winsome, utterly and completely, I asked one thing of you. One, and in 5 years you could not manage it." Her hands were shaking. She pressed them flat against the tablecloth to still them. "I am your wife," she said. "We made vows, before God, before witnesses, for better or for worse. And this," he said, pushing his plate away, "is decidedly the worse. I have endured it long enough." She left the house on a grey morning at the end of October, with a trunk that contained 3 dresses, a Bible, her mother's locket, and £5 in coin. Aldric did not come to the door to see her off. His mother did, standing at the parlour window with a cup of chocolate, watching Winsome climb into the hired cart with the expression of someone observing a stain being scrubbed from a carpet. "Good riddance," she said to the housekeeper, loud enough to carry through the glass. Winsome heard her. She heard every word, and she carried those words with her down the lane, past the village green, past the church where she had married, past the life she had tried so desperately to build, carried them like stones sewn into the lining of her coat, heavy and sharp and impossible to set down. She went to Bath. It was the only place she could think of. A city large enough to disappear into, anonymous enough that she might find work without her history preceding her. She rented a room above a chandler's shop for 2 shillings a week and began taking in mending and lacework. Her fingers, which had grown soft during the years of her marriage, hardened again. Her eyes which had grown used to candlelight and comfort, adjusted to the dim corner where she worked from dawn until her vision blurred. She ate once a day. She spoke to almost no one. She existed in a kind of suspended grief, moving through the hours like a woman walking through fog, unable to see what lay ahead and unwilling to look at what lay behind. Now, here is something important to understand about Winsome's situation. In 1847, a separated woman occupied a peculiar and devastating legal limbo. She was no longer under her husband's roof, yet she remained in the eyes of the law, his property. Any money she earned technically belonged to him. Any contract she signed could be contested. She could not rent a house in her own name, could not open a bank account, could not sue or be sued. The Married Women's Property Act, which would begin to grant wives the right to their own earnings, was still a decade away. When Winsome sat in that room above the chandler's shop, mending lace for pennies, she was doing so as a legal ghost, a woman who existed in the world, but not in the law. Every coin she earned, every shilling she saved, she held only at the sufferance of a husband who had thrown her out, but still technically owned every thread she stitched. But she did not break. And this is the part of the story that matters most. She trembled. She wept. She pressed her fists against her mouth in the small hours of the night and screamed silently into the darkness. But she did not break. It was in her 4th month in Bath that she met Bridget Nye. Mrs. Nye was a widow of 53, sharp-tongued and warm-hearted, who ran a small haberdashery 2 streets from Winsome's lodgings. She noticed Winsome the way a hawk notices movement in the grass. With instant, focused attention, she saw the quality of the lacework Winsome brought to sell. She saw the shadows under her eyes and the careful way she counted every penny. She saw, beneath the exhaustion and the grief, a woman of intelligence and dignity who had been treated very badly indeed. "You will work for me," Mrs. Nye announced one afternoon, without preamble or invitation. "I need someone with steady hands and good eyes, and you have both. Tuesdays through Saturdays, 4 shillings a week, plus meals. And you will eat," she added with a pointed look at Winsome's thinning frame. "Properly. None of this once-a-day nonsense." Winsome opened her mouth to refuse, pride, that stubborn, useless companion, rising in her throat. But Mrs. Nye silenced her with a raised hand. "I am not offering charity. I am offering employment. There is a difference, and you are clever enough to know it. Now sit down and eat this soup before I lose my patience entirely." Winsome sat. She ate the soup. And for the first time in months, something inside her shifted. Not healed, not yet, but shifted. Like a bone that had been set crookedly and was beginning, very slowly, to find its proper alignment. The weeks that followed brought small mercies, regular meals, meaningful work, the companionship of a woman who did not pity her, but respected her, which was infinitely more valuable. Winsome's colour returned. Her hands steadied. She began to speak again. Not much, not freely, but enough to matter. It was on a Saturday in March, at the weekly market in Bath, that everything changed. Winsome had been sent to purchase ribbon. Mrs. Nye was particular about her ribbon, insisting on silk from a specific merchant who set up his stall near the Abbey. And she was examining a bolt of cream-coloured silk when she felt it. That prickling awareness, the sensation of being watched. She looked up. He was standing 20 feet away beside a carriage so large and so black and so immaculate that it looked as though it had been carved from a single piece of obsidian. He was tall, uncommonly tall, with dark hair swept back from a face that was all angles and shadows. He wore a greatcoat of charcoal wool, and his gloves were grey kid, and there was something about the way he stood, utterly still, utterly contained, that made the air around him seem to hum with restrained force. He was looking at her, not glancing, not passing his gaze over her on the way to something more interesting, looking with an intensity that made her breath catch and her fingers tighten on the ribbon she was holding. Their eyes met. His were grey, not the soft dove-wing grey of a winter sky, but the hard, bright grey of polished steel. And in them she saw something she could not name, something that looked impossibly like recognition. Then he turned away. He said something to the man standing beside the carriage, a lean, sharp-faced man who nodded once and produced a small notebook, and climbed into the carriage without looking back. The door closed, the horses moved, and he was gone. Winsome stood in the market square with a bolt of cream ribbon pressed against her chest and her heart hammering so loudly she was certain the ribbon merchant could hear it. "Now, I need to pause here and tell you something important. That man was Ransom Blackett, the Duke of Glenmire." And he had not stumbled upon Winsome Leith by accident. He had been looking for her for 2 years, systematically, methodically, with the full resources of one of the largest fortunes in the west of England at his disposal. But she did not know that yet. She would not know it for some time. What she knew was this: a stranger had looked at her in a market square, and she had felt for the first time in years seen. Let me tell you about Ransom Blackett, because his story is as essential to this tale as hers. He was 36, a widower. His first wife, Lady Marjorie, had died in childbirth 7 years earlier, taking their only child, a daughter, with her. The grief had nearly destroyed him. For 2 years after their deaths he had not left his estate. He had not attended Parliament, where his seat gathered dust. He had not appeared at any ball, any dinner, any shooting party. He had retreated into Glenmire Hall, a sprawling ancient house on the Somerset border, and pulled the gates shut behind him. The world assumed he was mad, or broken, or both. He was neither. He was simply a man who had loved his wife with a ferocity that left no room for pretense, and when she died, he found that the world without her in it was a place he could not bear to inhabit. So he inhabited a smaller world instead. His library, his stables, his correspondence, the management of his vast estates, and waited for the pain to become something he could carry rather than something that carried him. It took 2 years, but eventually the weight shifted. He began to venture out, not into society, never that, but into the towns and villages near his estate. He rode, he walked, he visited tenants. And on a cool September morning in 1845, he stopped at a village market in Chippenham to purchase a saddle fitting. And he saw a woman with dark hair and winter honey eyes selling lacework from a basket. She did not see him. She was absorbed in her work, her fingers moving with a precision and grace that arrested him completely. She was thin, too thin, and there were shadows beneath her eyes, and her dress was clean, but mended in 3 places that he could count. But there was something about the way she held herself, something unbowed, something fierce and quiet and absolutely unbreakable. He stood and watched her for 11 minutes. He counted, and in those 11 minutes, something happened to him that he had believed would never happen again. Something cracked open in his chest. Something that had been locked away since Marjorie's death stirred and lifted its head and looked at this woman with her basket of lace and her mended dress and said, "Her." He did not approach her. He could not. The feeling was too new, too raw, too impossible. He was a duke. She was... He did not even know her name. He returned to his carriage. He instructed his man of business, Mr. Caius Rook, to find out everything about her. Everything. Within a week, Rook had a full accounting. Her name was Winsome Leith, née Parry, aged 24, daughter of a deceased vicar, cast out by her husband, Sir Aldric Poole, for failure to produce an heir. Living in Bath, working for a haberdasher. No family, no fortune, no prospects, and the Duke, this cold, remote, supposedly broken man, read the report twice, folded it carefully, placed it in the breast pocket of his coat, and said, "I want her portrait painted." "Your Grace?" Rook had said, blinking. "A miniature. I want an artist to observe her at the market and paint her likeness. She is not to know. No one is to know." Rook, who had served the Duke for 15 years and prided himself on his composure, merely nodded. "Very good, Your Grace." The miniature was completed 3 weeks later by an artist who had been told he was painting a study of market women for a patron's collection. It was exquisite. 3 inches square, set in a silver frame, capturing precisely the angle of her jaw and the darkness of her hair and that particular quality of her gaze that was equal parts vigilance and sorrow. The Duke kept it in his breast pocket. He carried it everywhere. He took it out at odd moments, in the morning before his coffee had cooled, in the evening by the fire when the house was quiet and the shadows were long. He looked at it the way a man in a desert looks at water, but he did not approach her, not yet. He was waiting. For what? Even he could not entirely say. Perhaps for her to heal, perhaps for himself to be certain that what he felt was not merely the echo of old grief attaching itself to a new face. Perhaps for the right moment. Because a duke does not simply walk up to a woman in a market square and say what he wanted to say, which was, "I have been watching you, and you are the most extraordinary thing I have ever seen, and I would very much like to spend the rest of my life ensuring that no one ever hurts you again." Instead, he watched. From a distance, through Rook's reports, through the miniature in his pocket, through the careful, patient, obsessive vigilance of a man who has found the thing he wants and will not be rushed in the claiming of it. 2 years passed in this manner, and then on a Saturday morning in March of 1847, he saw her at the market in Bath, and their eyes met, and something in his careful patience snapped like a wire pulled too tight. She had seen him. She had looked at him. And the expression on her face, startled, wary, but not afraid, curious even, told him that the waiting was over. He went home to Glenmire Hall that evening and summoned Rook to his study. "Make an introduction," he said. Rook raised an eyebrow. "An introduction, Your Grace? To whom?" The Duke looked at him steadily. "You know to whom." And Rook, because he was very good at his job, merely said, "Of course, Your Grace. I will arrange it." The arrangement took the form of a commission. Mrs. Nye received a letter, delivered by a footman in ducal livery, requesting her finest lacework for a set of bedchamber curtains at Glenmire Hall. The sum offered was staggering. £50 for the commission, with materials provided. Mrs. Nye, no fool, accepted immediately and assigned Winsome to the project. Winsome was to deliver samples to the hall in person. Mrs. Nye insisted upon it. She would have insisted upon it regardless. She believed in personal service. But the Duke's letter had, with studied casualness, mentioned that the project would require several consultations. I know what you are thinking, and I know what you might be shouting at your screen right now, but trust me, keep listening. Winsome arrived at Glenmire Hall on a Thursday afternoon in April, carrying a basket of lace samples and wearing her best dress, the blue one, the one Mrs. Nye had helped her alter so that it no longer hung on her frame like a curtain on a pole. She had gained weight in the past months. Her cheeks had colour again. But standing before the massive iron gates of Glenmire Hall, looking up at a house that seemed to stretch across the entire horizon, she felt very small indeed. Rook met her at the door. He was polite, efficient, and entirely unhelpful in explaining why the Duke of Glenmire wished to discuss curtain lace in person, when any competent housekeeper could have managed the matter. The Duke was in the library. Of course he was. It was a room designed to intimidate. 3 stories of books rising to a ceiling painted with clouds, a fire blazing in a hearth large enough to stand in, and leather chairs the colour of old wine. He was standing by the window when she entered. He turned slowly. Their eyes met for the second time. "Mrs. Leith," he said. His voice was low and steady, but there was a tension in it, like a bowstring drawn back and held. "Thank you for coming." "Your Grace," she replied, and curtsied. Her heart was doing something complicated and unhelpful in her chest. The consultation lasted 40 minutes. They discussed lace. They discussed pattern. They discussed thread weight and weave density and the particular translucency of bobbin lace versus needle lace. And throughout the entire conversation, neither of them was thinking about lace at all. He asked her to return the following week with additional samples. She agreed. She returned, and the week after that, and the week after that, the curtain commission, which should have taken a fortnight to specify, stretched across 2 months of weekly visits. Visits that grew longer, that moved from the library to the garden, from professional consultation to cautious conversation, from conversation to something that neither of them had a name for, but both of them felt like gravity. She learned that he was quiet because he chose his words carefully, not because he lacked them, that his grief had not made him cold, but careful, that he read everything, philosophy, history, novels, agricultural reports, and remembered what he read with startling precision, that he listened to her, truly listened, in a way that no man in her life ever had. He learned that she was stronger than anyone gave her credit for, that her quietness was not submission but observation, that she could be funny, wryly, unexpectedly funny, when she felt safe enough to speak freely, that she had survived things that would have destroyed a lesser spirit, and that the surviving had made her not bitter, but luminous, as though pain had burned away everything inessential and left only the purest version of who she was. On her 5th visit, something changed. She arrived to find that the Duke had arranged tea in the orangery rather than the library. The room was warm with the scent of lemon trees and damp earth, and the light that filtered through the glass ceiling was soft and golden. He had remembered, from a passing comment she had made 3 weeks earlier, that she missed the smell of growing things, that in the years of her marriage, the only room in Aldric's house that had brought her comfort was the small conservatory where she tended herbs. He had remembered, and he had arranged an entire afternoon around that memory. She stood in the doorway of the orangery and felt something crack inside her chest. Not break. She had done enough breaking. This was something else, something opening, something that had been sealed shut for so long that the hinges had rusted, and now slowly, painfully, it was beginning to move. "You remembered," she said quietly. He looked at her with an expression that was almost uncertain, the only time she had ever seen uncertainty on his face. "I remember everything you tell me," he said. They sat among the lemon trees that afternoon, and for the first time, they did not discuss lace at all. She told him about her father, the vicar, who had taught her to read Latin before she was 10 and who had died believing she was happy. She told him about the garden she had planted at Aldric's house, the one his mother had ordered ripped out because it attracted bees near the east wing. She told him about the night she left and the darkness of the road and the weight of the bag in her hand. She had not planned to tell him any of this. The words simply came, drawn out by his silence, by the quality of his attention. By the way, he sat perfectly still and looked at her, as though nothing in the world existed except her voice. When she finished, there was a long pause. The lemon trees rustled in the warm air. A bee hummed somewhere among the blossoms. "He should be horsewhipped," the Duke said. His voice was perfectly level. His hands, resting on his knees, were not. Winsome looked at those hands, large, strong, white-knuckled, and understood with a clarity that startled her that this man was furious, not the loud, explosive fury she had known with Aldric, something quieter, something far more dangerous, the controlled, patient fury of a man who had the power to destroy and the discipline to choose when. "It is in the past," she said. "It is not in the past," he replied. "It is in you. I can see it." She had no answer for that, because he was right. On her 6th visit, he showed her the library properly, not the formal tour he had given her on the first day, but the real library, the shelves he actually used, the books with cracked spines and dog-eared pages and margin notes in his small, precise hand. He pulled down a volume of Virgil and opened it to a passage he had underlined years ago and read it to her in Latin. And then, because she had told him her father had taught her, he asked her to translate. She did, haltingly at first, then with growing confidence, the old language coming back to her like a song, half forgotten. When she finished, he looked at her with an expression she could not read. "Your father taught you well," he said. "My father believed that a woman's mind was not an ornament," she replied. "He believed it was a tool, and that it should be sharpened." He was correct. Most men would disagree. "Most men," the Duke said, "are fools." She laughed. It was the first time she had laughed in his presence, a real laugh, full and unguarded, and the sound of it changed the room the way sunlight changes a landscape. Everything became warmer, brighter, more alive. He stared at her, his lips parted. And for one fleeting second, The mask he wore, the Duke's mask, the widower's mask, the careful, controlled mask of a man who had taught himself to feel nothing, slipped. And what she saw beneath it was so raw, so desperate, so utterly, helplessly devoted that she had to look away. She understood in that moment that this man did not merely want her, he needed her. And the difference between those two things was the difference between a fire in a hearth and a fire in the blood. It was during her 7th visit that the jealousy arrived. She had come to the hall as usual, but this time the Duke was delayed, a matter with his steward that required his attention. And Rook had shown her to the garden to wait. She was sitting on a stone bench near the rose walk, her basket of lace samples beside her, when a man she did not recognize came walking up the path. He was perhaps 30, fair-haired, with the kind of easy confidence that comes from inherited wealth and no responsibilities. He introduced himself as Lord Fortham, a neighbour whose estate bordered the Duke's to the north. "You must be the lace-maker," he said, with a smile that was a shade too familiar. "I have heard about you. The whole county has heard about you." Winsome stiffened. "Heard what, exactly?" "That the reclusive Duke of Glenmire has been ordering curtain lace for 2 months, and has yet to receive a single curtain." Fortham's smile widened. "People are beginning to talk." "People may talk as they please," Winsome said, her voice cool. "The commission is a professional matter." "Of course," Fortham said. He sat down beside her on the bench, uninvited, too close. "I only mean to say that if you ever find yourself in need of a patron with fewer complications, my door is always open." Winsome rose to her feet. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. "Thank you, Lord Fortham. I am quite content with my current arrangements." But Fortham was not finished. He reached for her hand, a gesture so presumptuous, so casually proprietary, that she felt it like a slap. And then the Duke's voice came from the end of the rose walk. It was quiet. It carried the way thunder carries. Not because it is loud, but because the air itself seems to step aside for it. Fortham, one word, just the name. But the temperature in the garden dropped by 10 degrees. Fortham turned. The colour left his face in stages. First his cheeks, then his lips, then even his ears went white. He released Winsome's hand as though it had burned him. "Your Grace," he stammered. "I was merely—" You were leaving," the Duke said. He had not moved from the end of the path. He did not need to. His presence filled the garden the way smoke fills a room. Now. Fortham left. He did not walk. He fled, his boots crunching on the gravel with the hurried rhythm of a man who has just realized he has put his hand into a fire. The Duke stood where he was for a long moment, after Fortham disappeared. His jaw was set. A muscle ticked in his cheek. His eyes, those steel grey eyes, were fixed on the place where Fortham's hand had touched Winsome's, and in them burned something that was not quite anger and not quite jealousy, but something older and more primal than either. "He did not touch me," Winsome said. "Not really." The Duke looked at her. His voice, when it came, was controlled with visible effort. "He should not have come near you. He will not come near you again." She studied his face. The intensity she saw there should have frightened her. It was the look of a man who considered her his. Absolutely, irrevocably, in a way that went beyond courtship or commission or curtain lace. And perhaps a year earlier it would have frightened her. She had spent 5 years married to a man who treated her as property, after all. She knew what possession looked like. But this was different. She could feel the difference in her bones. Aldric's possessiveness had been about control, about owning her the way he owned his horses or his house. The Duke's possessiveness was about protection, about standing between her and anything that might cause her pain. The distinction was as vast as the distance between a cage and a shelter, and she understood it instinctively, the way one understands the difference between the dark of a cellar and the dark of a summer night. "Thank you," she said simply. He exhaled slowly. Then, with effort, he unclenched his jaw and offered her his arm. "Shall we discuss lace?" She almost smiled. She almost laughed. She took his arm, and the warmth of it, solid, steady, human, travelled through the fabric of his coat and into her skin and settled there like a promise. But what happened next she did not expect, and this is the moment that nearly destroyed everything before it could begin. It was a Thursday in late May. Winsome was riding in the Duke's carriage back to Bath after her 8th visit. The road wound through a narrow valley between Glenmire and the city, bordered on one side by dense woodland and on the other by a steep embankment that fell away to a river. The Duke had insisted she use his carriage for these visits. He would not hear of her travelling by public coach, and the driver, a careful man named Hicks, knew the road well. What Hicks did not know was that a tree had fallen across the road during the previous night's storm. The carriage rounded a bend at speed. Hicks hauled on the reins, and the horses, startled, terrified, veered hard to the left. The carriage tilted. The left wheels left the ground. Winsome was thrown against the door, her hands scrambling for purchase on the leather seat, and for one terrible, suspended moment the entire carriage hung at an angle over the embankment, balanced between the road and the river below. Then it crashed back down. The axle cracked, the horses screamed and plunged. Hicks was thrown from the hay box, and Winsome, inside the ruined carriage, struck her head against the window frame and crumbled into darkness. She awoke to the smell of wood smoke and the sound of a voice she knew. Winsome. The voice was hoarse, strained in a way she had never heard it. "Winsome, open your eyes." She opened them. She was in a room she did not recognize, low-ceilinged, warm, lit by a fire. She was lying on a narrow bed, and there was a cold cloth on her forehead, and the Duke was sitting beside her, his coat off, his shirt sleeves rolled to the elbow, his face so pale and so rigid that for a moment she thought he was the one who had been hurt. "What happened?" she whispered. "The carriage overturned," he said. His voice cracked on the word. "Hicks rode to the hall. I came." The words were coming fast now, as though they had been held back by force and could no longer be contained. "I came as fast as I could when I saw the carriage on its side, when I believed that you might." He stopped. He pressed his hand over his eyes. His shoulders shook once violently and then were still. She reached for his hand. She took it, and in that gesture, the touch of her fingers against his, the first deliberate physical contact between them, something broke open that could never be sealed again. "I am here," she said. He lowered his hand. His eyes were red. "Do not ever frighten me like that again." She managed a small smile. "I did not do it on purpose." He did not smile back. He held her hand as though it were the only solid thing in a dissolving world, and he said, in a voice so low she could barely hear it, "I cannot lose you. I have already lost everything once. I cannot lose you." And she understood in that moment that whatever this was between them, this unnamed, uncharted, impossible thing, it had moved beyond commission and courtship and careful distance. It had become essential. It had become the thing they could not live without. She stayed at the farmhouse that night, a tenant's cottage near the accident site, while Hicks was treated by the local surgeon and the carriage was cleared from the road. The Duke sat outside her door until dawn. When Rook arrived with a fresh carriage in the morning, the Duke handed Winsome into it with a gentleness that made the old steward look away and clear his throat. But here is where the story takes a turn that you might not expect, because Winsome, shaken by the accident and by the intensity of what she had seen in the Duke's eyes, did something that survivors of broken marriages often do. She pulled back. She did not come to Glenmire Hall the following Thursday. She sent a note, brief, polite, professional, explaining that the commission was nearly complete and that she would deliver the finished samples by post. The Duke read the note. He read it again. Then he set it on his desk and sat very still for a long time. "She is afraid," Rook said carefully, standing in the doorway. "I know," the Duke replied. "What will you do?" The Duke looked out the window, across the park, toward the road that led to Bath. "What I have always done," he said quietly. "Wait." But this time the waiting was different. This time it hurt. Winsome spent 2 weeks in Bath, working at the haberdashery, sleeping badly, eating without appetite. Mrs. Nye watched her with sharp, knowing eyes, but said nothing for the first 3 days. On the 4th day she set down her scissors, folded her arms and said, "You are in love with that Duke and you are running from it." Winsome's head snapped up. "I am not." "You are. And I understand why. The last man you trusted destroyed you. But this one is not that man, and you know it. I have seen the way he looks at you, Winsome. I have been alive for 53 years, and I have never once seen a man look at a woman the way he looks at you, as if you are the answer to a question he has been asking his whole life." Winsome's eyes filled. "I am frightened, Bridget." "Good," Mrs. Nye said. "That means it matters. Now stop hiding in my shop and go back to that ridiculous mansion before I lose all patience with you entirely." Winsome laughed. It was a wet, broken, grateful laugh, the kind that lives on the border between tears and joy. She went back to Glenmire Hall on a Friday, unannounced, carrying nothing but herself. Rook opened the door and, for the first and only time in 15 years of service, smiled. The Duke was in the garden, by the fish pond, standing exactly where he had stood the last time they were together, as though he had been waiting there the entire 2 weeks. Perhaps he had. She walked toward him across the grass, her heart in her throat, her hands shaking, every voice in her head telling her to turn back, to protect herself, to remember what happened the last time she trusted a man with her heart. She kept walking. He turned when he heard her footsteps. His face, that stern, carved, carefully guarded face, did something she had never seen it do before. It crumbled, just for a moment, just long enough for her to see everything beneath the surface. The relief, the longing, the fear that she would not come back. the desperate consuming love that he had carried in silence for 2 years and could no longer hide. "I'm sorry I stayed away," she said. He shook his head. "Do not apologize. Not to me. Not ever." They stood 3 feet apart. The fish pond rippled between them. The willows moved in the wind. And then she took 1 step forward, and he took 1 step forward, and they were close. So close that she could smell him, cedar and leather, and the clean, warm scent of skin. And his hand came up and touched her cheek lightly, as though she were made of something precious and breakable. She turned her face into his palm. She closed her eyes. And for the first time in years, she felt safe. His lips were a breath away from hers. She could feel the warmth of them, the nearness, the intention. Every nerve in her body was alive. Every part of her was saying yes. And then a blackbird burst from the willow tree with a clatter of wings, and they both startled, and the moment shattered like glass on stone. He pulled back, she pulled back. They looked at each other, breathing hard, and something passed between them that was more eloquent than any words either of them possessed. "Not yet," she whispered. "Not because I do not want to, but because when it happens I want to be whole." He nodded. His thumb traced her jawline once, a gesture so tender it made her chest ache. And then he dropped his hand. "I will wait," he said, "as long as you need. I have been waiting for 2 years. What is a little longer?" She smiled. A real smile, the kind that starts in the chest and rises through the body like warmth. One afternoon, walking in the garden a week later, he stopped beside the fish pond and said, without preamble, "I'm going to tell you something, and I want you to understand that I say it not to alarm you, but because I believe you deserve honesty above all things." She waited. The wind moved through the willows. "I did not commission those curtains because I needed curtains," he said. "I commissioned them because I needed a reason to see you." She stared at him. He reached into his breast pocket and produced a small silver frame. He opened it and held it out to her. She looked down and saw her own face, painted in miniature, looking back at her. "I have carried this for 2 years," he said, "since the first morning I saw you." Winsome took the miniature. Her hands were trembling. She looked at her own painted face. Thinner than she was now, sadder, with shadows beneath the eyes, and then she looked at him. At this tall, impossible, terrifying, gentle man who had carried her likeness against his heart for 2 years without speaking a word. "Why?" she whispered. "Of all the women in England, why me?" He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Because you are the most real person I have ever met. You carry pain, but you still stand. You were broken, but you did not stay down. That is the kind of woman I want beside me, the only kind." She did not answer for a long time. The wind moved, the fish pond rippled, a blackbird sang from the willow. Then she said very quietly, "I am afraid." He nodded. "I know, but I am not Aldric. I will not break your heart. I will guard it with everything I have." She looked at the miniature one more time. Then she closed the frame and held it out to him. "Keep it," she said, "but perhaps you might have a new one painted. This one is too thin. I eat properly now." And he smiled. A real smile, the first she had ever seen on his face. And it transformed him entirely. It made him human. It made him beautiful. Can I just say, this is one of my favorite scenes in this entire story. The way she deflects the intensity with humor, The way his smile changes everything. I rewrote this 3 times to get it right, and I think you can feel why. They married in June, a quiet ceremony in the chapel at Glenmire Hall, with Mrs. Nye as witness and Rook standing stiffly in his best coat, dabbing at his eyes when he thought no one was looking. There was no fanfare, no London season spectacle, no announcement in the papers, just a man and a woman and a set of vows spoken softly in a sunlit room. Now, it is worth noting what this marriage meant in practical terms. When Winsome became the Duchess of Glenmire, she did not merely gain a new name. She gained a position of extraordinary power. A duke's wife sat at the very apex of English society, outranked only by royalty. She would be addressed as Your Grace. She would take precedence over every countess, every marchioness, every woman in any room she entered who did not wear a crown. The woman Aldric Poole had thrown out with £5 and a mended trunk was now, by law and by title, one of the most important women in England. And then, because God has a sense of timing that puts even the best storytellers to shame, Winsome discovered 3 months into the marriage that she was with child. The physician was summoned, the examination was conducted, and the words that followed were words she had spent 6 years believing she would never hear. "You are expecting, Your Grace." The physician smiled. "And if I may say so, you are in excellent health." Winsome covered her mouth. Her eyes filled. She could not speak. The Duke, standing in the doorway with his arms folded and his expression carved from stone, said nothing for 10 full seconds. Then he crossed the room, knelt before her, and pressed his forehead against her hands. "Thank you," he said. His voice was rough. "Thank you." But the surprises were not finished. At the next examination, the physician listened longer, moved his instruments more carefully, frowned, then smiled, then laughed outright. "Your Grace," he said, turning to the Duke with an expression of barely contained delight, "there are 3 heartbeats." Winsome sat up. "3? Triplets, Your Grace. You are carrying 3 children." The Duke did not speak. He did not move. He simply stood there perfectly still while tears ran down his face in absolute silence. The boys were born on a cold February morning in 1848. 3 sons, healthy, loud, furious at the indignity of being born. The midwife wept. Mrs. Nye, who had travelled from Bath for the occasion, shouted so loudly with joy that the housekeeper later reported the crystal in the dining room had rattled. Winsome held them, all 3, their tiny fists, their screwed-up faces, their outraged cries. She held them, and she whispered, through tears that would not stop, "I was never Barren. I was never cursed. I was never the problem." And the Duke stood behind her, his hand on her shoulder, and said, "No, you were never the problem." Word spread. It always does. By spring the news had reached Wiltshire, and from Wiltshire it spread to Bath, and from Bath it spread everywhere that gossip travels, which is to say, everywhere. She had triplets, people whispered. The woman Aldric Poole cast out for barrenness, 3 sons, and her new husband is a duke. Some said it with wonder, some said it with envy, some said it with the particular vicious satisfaction of people who had always suspected that Aldric Poole was a fool and were delighted to be proven right. And Aldric Poole heard every word. "Now I know what you are thinking. You are thinking about Aldric. You are thinking about what he felt when the news reached him. And I will tell you, But first, let me tell you what he had been doing in the years since Winsome's departure. He had been failing. After casting Winsome out, Aldric had courted 3 different women in rapid succession. The first, a merchant's daughter from Bristol, had lasted 4 months before fleeing his house in tears, driven out by his mother's cruelty. The second, a widow from London, had stayed a year, but no pregnancy came, and she departed with a settlement that cost Aldric more than he could afford. The third, a shy clergyman's daughter who reminded him uncomfortably of the woman he had discarded, lasted 3 months before her father removed her, having heard rumours of Aldric's temper, no children from any of them. His mother, who had spent 5 years blaming Winsome for the empty nursery, had grown quieter on the subject. She still sat in the east wing. She still drank chocolate and issued pronouncements. But there was a nervousness in her now, a reluctance to meet her son's eyes when the topic of children arose. Aldric did not examine why. He could not afford to. Because to examine the pattern, 3 women, 5 years, no children, was to confront a possibility so devastating to his pride that his entire identity would collapse beneath its weight. So instead he did what men of fragile ego have done since the beginning of time. He found someone new to blame, someone new to distract him, and someone new to prove that the problem had never been his. Enter Miss Francesca Bray. Francesca was the daughter of a textile merchant who had made a considerable fortune and was desperate to spend it on a title for his daughter. She was 22, beautiful in the porcelain way that men of Aldric's generation found fashionable, and possessed of the kind of confidence that comes from never having been told no. She wore gowns from London. She spoke French badly, but often. She wanted to be a lady, and Aldric wanted to be admired. And between these 2 ambitions, they constructed something that passed for a courtship. They became engaged within 6 weeks. The wedding was planned for September. A grand affair, far grander than Aldric's finances strictly permitted, funded in large part by Francesca's father, who was only too happy to buy his daughter a title. The venue was the Assembly Rooms in Bath. The guest list was expansive. The flowers were ordered from London. The dress was made in Paris. And then, one evening, as Aldric sat in his study reviewing the guest list, a thought occurred to him. A small thought. A poisonous thought. The kind of thought that enters a man's mind like a splinter and works its way deeper with every passing hour until it reaches the bone. He picked up his pen and added a name to the list. Winsome Leith. Now styled, he had heard, as the Duchess of Glenmire, though he refused to believe that until he saw it with his own eyes. His friend Fortescue, reviewing the list over brandy, saw the name and frowned. "That is your former wife?" "Yes," Aldric said. "Why would you invite her?" Aldric swirled his brandy. "Because I want her to see." "See what?" "That I have moved on, that my life is better, that I was right to cast her out." Fortescue said nothing, but the look he gave Aldric was the look of a man watching someone walk toward a cliff edge in the dark. "Are you quite sure that is wise?" he asked carefully. Aldric smiled. It was not a pleasant smile. "Send her a first-class invitation. Front row. I want her where I can see her." The invitation arrived at Glenmire Hall on a Tuesday. It was delivered by the regular post, in an envelope of cream-coloured card, sealed with red wax. Winsome opened it at the breakfast table. She read it once. She read it again. Then she placed it carefully on the table beside her teacup. The Duke looked up from his correspondence. His grey eyes moved from her face to the card and back again. "What is it?" she told him. He said nothing for a very long time. Then he set down his pen, folded his hands, and said, in a voice that was perfectly calm and absolutely terrifying, "He wishes you to attend his wedding. Yes. To watch him marry another woman. Yes. Front row." The silence that followed was the kind of silence that has weight to it, the kind that presses against the walls and makes the fire in the hearth burn lower. Then the Duke said, "Do you wish to go?" Winsome looked at her sons, who were being fed in the nursery upstairs. She thought about the woman she had been when she left Aldric's house, broken, penniless, convinced that she was cursed. She thought about the woman she was now, a duchess, a mother, a wife who was loved beyond measure. "Yes," she said. "I do." He studied her face. "My goes not for revenge?" She shook her head slowly. "Because I want him to see the truth. I want everyone in that room to see it, not because I need their approval. I stopped needing that the day Mrs. Nye gave me soup and a job. But because the lie he told about me, that I was barren, that I was worthless, that I was the problem, that lie is still out there. And I want to stand in that room with our sons and let the truth speak for itself." The Duke was quiet. Then he said, "You will take the ducal carriage." She looked at him. "The black one," he said, "with the crest on the door, and you will wear the sapphires." She started to speak. "The Glenmire sapphires," he continued, his voice steady. "The ones that belong to my grandmother, and my great-grandmother, and every Duchess of Glenmire before them. Because that is who you are, and every person in that room will know it the moment you walk through the door." Winsome's eyes filled. She reached across the table and took his hand. "Will you come with me?" He shook his head. "This is your moment. But Rook will be in the carriage, and 2 footmen will attend you, and if that man so much as raises his voice in your direction, I will know about it within the hour, and what follows will not be pleasant for him." She smiled. "I love you, and I love you. Now, let me write a note to the nursemaids. The boys will need their best clothes. The night before the wedding." Winsome could not sleep. She stood at the window of their bedchamber, looking out over the park, watching moonlight silver the tops of the oaks. The Duke came and stood behind her. He placed his hands on her shoulders. "You don't have to do this if you do not want to," he said softly. "I want to," she replied. "Not to prove anything to him, but to remind myself that I survived, and that I am still standing." He kissed her cheek. "Whatever you decide, I am with you." Winsome turned to him. "Thank you. You have given me what no man could ever give me. Peace." He smiled. "And you gave me back joy." The morning of the wedding dawned bright and clear, the kind of September morning that seemed designed by God to make everything that happened beneath it feel more vivid, more real, more permanent. The sky was a deep, clean blue. The air tasted of harvest and late roses and the faintest edge of autumn. Winsome dressed slowly. Mrs. Nye had come to help, had insisted on it, in fact. Arriving at Glenmire Hall the night before with a bag of hairpins and an expression that brooked no argument. She stood behind Winsome now, threading the sapphires into her dark hair, her fingers careful and sure. "You are trembling," Mrs. Nye observed. "I know," Winsome said. "You do not have to. I know that too." Mrs. Nye was quiet for a moment, working a pin into place. Then she said, "When I was widowed, people told me I should feel relieved. My husband was not a kind man, but what I felt was not relief. It was rage. Rage that I had spent 20 years of my life in a house where I was not valued. And the only thing that healed that rage was the day I opened my shop and proved to myself, not to anyone else, that I was more than what he had made of me. She placed the last pin and stepped back. That is what you are doing today. Not for Aldric, not for the gossips, for yourself. Winsome looked at her reflection in the glass. The woman who looked back was not the woman who had left Aldric's house 3 years earlier. That woman had been hollow, translucent, a sketch of a person. This woman was solid, present, real. The midnight blue gown caught the light and shimmered like deep water. The sapphires burned at her throat, cold, ancient, impossibly beautiful, carrying the weight of 5 generations of duchesses who had worn them before her. She looked like what she was, a woman of power, of worth, of consequence. She looked like a duchess. The Duke came to the nursery door to see them off. The 3 boys, 7 months old now, plump and bright-eyed and endlessly curious about everything, were dressed in their white linen suits with blue sashes that matched her gown. One of them was chewing on his sash with concentrated fury. Another was attempting to remove his shoe. The third sat calmly in the nursemaid's arms, watching his mother with grey eyes that were a perfect miniature copy of his father's. The Duke looked at his wife. He looked at his sons. He said nothing for a long moment. Then he crossed the room, took her face in both hands and kissed her forehead. "Come home to me," he said. "Always," she replied. The ducal carriage was waiting in the drive. 4 matched grey horses, their coats brushed to silk, their harnesses gleaming with brass and black leather. The Glenmire crest, a falcon above 3 silver crescents, was painted on each door in gold leaf that caught the morning sun and threw light across the gravel. Rook stood by the carriage, dressed in his finest coat, his expression a carefully maintained mask of professional neutrality that did not quite conceal the satisfaction burning behind his eyes. 2 footmen in full ducal livery, navy blue coats with gold braid, white gloves, powdered wigs, flanked the carriage door. It was, by any measure, an entrance designed to communicate one thing. The woman inside this carriage is under the protection of one of the most powerful men in England, and you will treat her accordingly. Winsome climbed in. The nursemaids handed up the boys one by one. Mrs. Nye settled herself on the opposite seat with the expression of a woman who fully intended to enjoy every moment of what was about to happen. The door closed. The coachman shook the reins, and the carriage moved down the long elm-lined drive of Glenmire Hall toward Bath, toward the assembly rooms, toward the man who had once called her nothing. "If you think you know where this is going, I promise you—" The reality was more devastating than anything Aldric Poole could have imagined. The wedding of Sir Aldric Poole and Miss Francesca Bray was scheduled for 2 o'clock on a Saturday afternoon in September of 1848. The assembly rooms in Bath had been decorated with roses and hothouse orchids. A string quartet played Handel. The pews were filled with the local gentry, several London acquaintances who had been persuaded to make the journey, and Francesca's father, who sat in the front row with the satisfied expression of a man whose investment was about to yield returns. Aldric stood at the altar in a coat of dark blue superfine, his cravat starched to perfection, his boots gleaming. He was smiling. The smile did not reach his eyes, but it was broad enough and bright enough to pass in the candlelight for genuine pleasure. He had positioned himself so that he could see the entrance. He had done this deliberately. He wanted to see her arrive. "She will come in a hired coach," he had told Fortescue that morning, wearing something plain, looking older than her years, "and she will see Francesca, beautiful, young, glittering Francesca, walking down the aisle, and she will understand, finally, what she lost." He was wrong about everything. At 10 minutes past 2, a murmur rippled through the crowd near the entrance. It began as a whisper and grew into a swell, passing from pew to pew like a wave. The doors of the assembly rooms opened. Outside, visible through the doorway, stood a carriage. Not a hired coach, not a modest conveyance, a carriage of polished black lacquer with gold fittings drawn by 4 matched grey horses, with the crest on the door that every person in Bath, indeed every person in the west of England, recognised instantly, the crest of the Duke of Glenmire. A footman in ducal livery opened the carriage door and extended his hand. Out stepped Winsome. She wore a gown of deep midnight blue, cut in the latest fashion, with sapphires at her throat and in her dark hair. Not costume jewellery, not paste. The Glenmire sapphires, stones that had been in the Blackett family for 5 generations, worth more than Aldric's entire estate and everything in it. She looked beautiful, not the fragile, hollow beauty of her years with Aldric, the kind that comes from skipping meals and sleeping badly, but the solid, luminous beauty of a woman who is healthy, loved, and at peace. And beside her, holding her hands, were 3 small boys, triplets, dressed identically in white linen suits with blue sashes, dark-haired, grey-eyed, unmistakably the sons of a duke. They walked with the unsteady gravity of very young children, their small feet careful on the stone floor, their faces curious and unafraid. The hall went silent. Every head turned, every conversation stopped, every hand holding a glass or a fan or a prayer book went still. Winsome walked down the aisle, not quickly, not slowly, steadily, with the quiet, unhurried confidence of a woman who knows exactly who she is and has nothing left to prove to anyone. She reached the front row, the seat Aldric had reserved for her. She sat down. Her sons climbed onto the pew beside her, one of them pressing his face into her sleeve, the other 2 gazing around the room with wide, fascinated eyes. She folded her hands in her lap. She looked up at the altar, and she waited. Aldric could not move. He stood at the altar, like a man who had been struck by lightning, upright, rigid, his face drained of every trace of colour. His mouth opened. No sound came out. Fortescue, standing behind him, whispered, "Breathe." But Aldric was not breathing. He was looking at the children, 3 of them, 3 sons, hers. The woman he had called Barren, the woman he had called cursed, the woman he had thrown out with £5 and a mended trunk, 3 sons, and the crest on the carriage door, the Glenmire crest, meant that their father was a duke, not a baronet, not a man who measured his worth in £900 a year and pretended it was 9,000. A duke, a man whose annual income exceeded £40,000. A man whose word could move markets, topple families, and redirect the course of English politics. When we speak of a duke in 1848, England, we are speaking of a level of power that is almost impossible to comprehend today. There were fewer than 30 dukes in the Gyanidi entire country. Fewer than 30 men who held that rank. Their estates spanned counties. Their tenants numbered in the thousands. Their political influence shaped legislation, controlled boroughs, and determined the direction of national policy. When such a man married a woman, he elevated her to a station so far above the petty cruelties of a Wiltshire baronet that the distance between them became almost comical. Aldric Poole had cast Winsome out like refuse. The Duke of Glenmire had crowned her. The string quartet had stopped playing. The vicar were looking uncertainly between the altar and the entrance. Francesca, who had been waiting in the antechamber for her cue, peered through the doorway and saw the scene. "Who is that?" she hissed to her bridesmaid. The bridesmaid swallowed. "I believe that is his former wife." Francesca stared. "Those children! She has children?" "Triplets," the bridesmaid whispered. Francesca's face went through several colours in rapid succession. She emerged from the antechamber with her veil pulled back. Her bouquet gripped so tightly the stems were bending, and walked to the altar with the expression of a woman who has just realized she has purchased something at a far higher price than it is worth. She reached Aldric's side and whispered, "You told me she was Barren." "I thought she was," he managed. "You thought." Her voice was rising. "You destroyed that woman's life because you thought. And now she is sitting in the front row with 3 sons and the Glenmire sapphires. And you are standing here asking me to marry you." The vicar cleared his throat. "Perhaps we might begin." Francesca turned on Aldric with a fury that was magnificent in its precision. "Did you ever see a physician yourself?" she demanded. Aldric flinched. "That is not—" "Did you?" The hall was absolutely silent, 200 people holding their breath. "No," Aldric said. His voice was barely audible. Francesca stared at him. Then she laughed. A short, sharp sound, utterly devoid of humour. "So, you blamed her? For 5 years, you called her Barren. You cast her out. You destroyed her reputation. And you never once considered that the problem might be yours." She dropped her bouquet. It hit the floor with a soft thud that echoed through the silent room like a cannon shot. "I will not marry you," Francesca said. "Not today, not ever." She turned and walked out of the assembly rooms without looking back. Her bridesmaids followed. Her father, after a moment of frozen horror, stood and followed too, pausing only to give Aldric a look of such withering contempt that several people in the back rows would later describe it as physically painful to witness. The hall erupted. Whispers became murmurs, became open conversation. People turned to each other with wide eyes and mouths that could not decide between shock and satisfaction. So it was him all along. She was never the problem. That poor woman. And now she is a duchess. He invited her here to humiliate her. Can you imagine? Aldric stood alone at the altar. His coat, which had seemed so fine that morning, now hung on him like a costume from a play that had been cancelled. His face was grey. His hands were shaking. He looked at Winsome. She looked back at him, and on her face was not triumph, not mockery, not the gloating satisfaction of a woman who has won. There was something worse, something far more devastating. Compassion. She pitied him. She looked at the man who had destroyed her life, and she felt sorry for him, and he could see it, and it was the most annihilating thing he had ever experienced, because cruelty he could have borne. Gloating he could have deflected. Even rage he could have met with his own rage. But pity, quiet, genuine, unforced pity, told him that she had moved so far beyond him, had risen so completely above the wreckage he had made of her life, that he was no longer even worth her anger. She stood. She gathered her sons. She walked back up the aisle, past the whispers and the stares and the dropped bouquet and the crumbling ruins of the man who had once called her worthless. One of the boys turned his head and looked back at the altar with curious grey eyes. His father's eyes, the Duke of Glenmire's eyes. And Aldric flinched as though he had been struck. But the story does not end at the altar. Not quite. Because as Winsome neared the door, Aldric moved. It was the movement of a man not thinking but reacting. The lunge of a drowning man toward anything solid. He came down from the altar in 3 strides, his face twisted, his hand outstretched. He caught her arm in the corridor between the assembly rooms and the entrance hall, his fingers closing around her wrist with a grip that was not gentle. "Winsome," he said. His voice was ragged. "Wait. You have to listen to me. You have to understand." She turned. Her eyes met his, and her voice when she spoke was steady as stone. "Remove your hand from me," she said. "You lost the right to touch me 3 years ago. But I need to explain. There is nothing to explain. I already know the truth. I have known it longer than you have." He did not release her arm. His grip tightened. His face was desperate, wild, the face of a man who had just watched everything he believed about himself collapse in public, and who was grasping at the one person he imagined might help him rebuild the fiction. "Please," he said, "give me another chance. I was wrong. I know that now. Come back to me. We can try again. We can—" And then a voice spoke from behind him, a voice he did not recognize, a voice like iron wrapped in velvet. "I believe the lady asked you to remove your hand." Aldric turned. Rook stood in the corridor. He was not a large man. He was not an imposing man. He was, by all appearances, a lean, sharp-featured steward in a well-cut coat. But behind him stood 2 footmen in ducal livery, each of them 6 feet tall and built like dock workers, and the expression on Rook's face was the expression of a man who had been given very specific instructions about what to do if this exact situation arose. "Sir Aldric," Rook said pleasantly. "I serve His Grace the Duke of Glenmire. You are currently holding the arm of His Grace's wife. I will ask you once, and only once, to release her." Aldric's hand fell away as though her skin had burned him. He took a step back, then another. His eyes darted between Rook and the footmen, and Winsome and the boys, who were watching from behind their nursemaid skirts with wide, confused eyes. "Tell your master," Aldric said, and his voice was the voice of a man trying to salvage dignity from wreckage. "Tell your master that he is welcome to my leftovers." Rook smiled. It was the most terrifying smile Winsome had ever seen. Thin, precise, and absolutely devoid of warmth. "I will tell His Grace exactly what occurred here," Rook said. Every word, every gesture, every bruise on her Grace's wrist, and His Grace will respond in the manner he sees fit. He offered his arm to Winsome. She took it. They walked out of the assembly rooms and into the sunlight. In the carriage, Mrs. Nye examined Winsome's wrist. There were finger marks, 4 red ovals where Aldric had gripped her. Mrs. Nye's face went tight with anger. "That animal," she whispered. "It does not matter," Winsome said, but her voice shook, and Mrs. Nye noticed, and one of the boys climbed into her lap and pressed his face against her chest, as though he could sense that his mother needed holding. When the Duke received Rook's report that evening, delivered in the study with the door closed, he listened in silence. He did not move. He did not interrupt. He sat in his chair with his hands flat on the desk and listened to every word. When Rook finished, the Duke said, "Show me her wrist." Rook paused. "Your Grace? Ask her to come in. I want to see her wrist." Winsome came. She showed him. The marks had darkened to purple. The Duke looked at the bruises for a long time. His face did not change. His voice did not change. But something in his eyes, something deep and cold and ancient, shifted into a gear that Rook had never seen before, and that Rook, who had served in the military before entering the Duke's service, recognized immediately. It was the look of a man who had just decided to destroy someone, completely, methodically, without mercy. "Rook," the Duke said quietly, "I want Sir Aldric Poole's debts purchased. Every note, every mortgage, every line of credit he holds with every bank and lender in the west of England. I want them purchased by the end of the month. And then I want them called in, all of them, at once." Rook nodded. "And the house, Your Grace?" The Duke considered. "Let him keep the house," he said. "I want him to sit in it and watch it fall apart around him. I want him to hear the rain through the roof and know that no one is coming to fix it. That is a more fitting punishment than homelessness." It was, Rook would later reflect, the most terrifying thing he had ever heard his employer say. Not because of its cruelty, but because of its precision. The Duke was not acting from rage. He was acting from calculation. And that was infinitely more dangerous. At the door, Winsome paused. She did not turn around. She did not say a word. She simply lifted her chin, took her son's hands, and stepped into the September sunlight and the waiting carriage with the ducal crest on the door. The footman closed the door gently behind her. The coachman shook the reins. The 4 grey horses moved forward, their hooves striking the cobblestones in perfect rhythm, and the carriage rolled away from the assembly rooms, away from the ruins of Aldric Poole's wedding, away from the life she had once known and the pain she had once carried. Inside the carriage, she held her boys close. Mrs. Nye sat. Across from her, very quiet. It was unlike her. She had been quiet since the corridor, since Aldric's hand on Winsome's wrist, since the look in Rook's eyes. Finally, Mrs. Nye spoke. "Do you know what I saw in there?" Winsome shook her head. "I saw a woman who could have screamed and didn't, who could have gloated and didn't, who could have fallen apart and didn't." Mrs. Nye's voice was thick. "I saw the woman I always knew you were, and so did every person in that room." Winsome reached across the carriage and took her friend's hand. "You gave me soup, Bridget, when I had nothing. You gave me work and dignity and a reason to get up in the morning. If I am standing today, it is because you held me up when I could not stand alone." Mrs. Nye wiped her eyes fiercely. "Stop that. You will ruin my composure." One of the boys looked up at her and said, in the way that very small children say things, simply without understanding the weight of the words, "Mamma, are you happy?" She smiled. The tears on her cheeks caught her afternoon light. "Yes," she said, "I am more than happy. I am free." In the weeks that followed, the story spread through every drawing room and dining table in the west of England. Aldric, his pride in ruins, finally did what Winsome had begged him to do years earlier. He visited a physician. The examination was thorough. The diagnosis was plain: a condition that had likely been present since his youth, a condition that no amount of blame or cruelty or casting out of wives could alter. The problem had always been his. Every accusation he had hurled at Winsome, every insult his mother had delivered over tea, every whisper he had encouraged among the neighbours, but all of it had been a lie built on pride and sustained by cowardice. His mother, when told, sat in silence for a very long time. Then she said, "I suppose I owe that girl an apology. She never sent one." Aldric's finances, already strained by the cost of the cancelled wedding, crumbled further when Francesca's father demanded the return of every penny he had invested. But the real destruction came 3 weeks later, on a morning that began like any other. Aldric was at his breakfast table, alone now, since his mother had retreated to her sister's house in Devon, unable to bear the stares of the Wiltshire neighbours, when his butler entered with the post. There were 7 letters. All of them bore the seals of banks and creditors. All of them said the same thing: "Your debts have been acquired by a new holder. Full repayment is demanded within 30 days. Failure to comply will result in the seizure of assets." Aldric read the first letter. He read the second. By the third, his hands were shaking. By the 5th, he understood. Someone had purchased every debt he held: his mortgage, his line of credit at Coots, his outstanding bills with his tailor, his wine merchant, even the small loan he had taken to fund the wedding flower, and was now calling them all in at once. The total exceeded £2,000. He had at that moment perhaps 80 in ready money. He turned the 7th letter over. On the back, in a hand he did not recognize, someone had written a single line: "You should not have touched her." It is worth pausing here to explain what was happening, because the mechanism of the Duke's revenge was a distinctly aristocratic one. In 1848, England, a man's debts were transferable. They could be bought and sold between creditors like any other commodity. A wealthy man could, if he chose, purchase another man's obligations from the original lender and then demand immediate repayment. It was perfectly legal. It was rarely done because it required enormous capital and a willingness to make a permanent enemy. But for a duke with £40,000 a year and a very specific reason to destroy a Wiltshire baronet, it was child's play. Aldric sat at his breakfast table for a long time after reading those letters. The tea grew cold, the toast hardened, a fly landed on the butter, and he did not wave it away. He simply sat, staring at the 7 letters spread before him like a hand of cards in a game he had already lost. The house in Wiltshire, which had always leaked, began to leak more. The servants, unpaid, began to leave. First the cook, then the gardener, then the maids, then even the butler who had served the Poole family for 20 years. The neighbours, who had once accepted his invitations with enthusiasm, began to decline them with excuses that grew thinner by the week. By Christmas he was eating cold suppers, alone, in a house that echoed with emptiness, surrounded by rooms where the furniture had been sold to cover the most pressing debts. He wrote to Winsome once. A short letter delivered by the regular post to Glenmire Hall. It said, "I was wrong. I see that now. I destroyed the only good thing in my life, and I will carry that knowledge until I die. I do not ask for your forgiveness. I do not deserve it. I ask only that you know. I understand now what I did to you, and I am sorry." Winsome read the letter in the garden. sitting on the bench beside the fish pond where the Duke had first shown her the miniature. She read it twice. Then she folded it and placed it in the drawer of her writing desk, beside the silver frame that held her old portrait. She was not angry. She was not bitter. She was not triumphant. She was at peace. That evening she sat in the nursery with the Duke while the boys slept. The firelight played across the walls, casting soft shadows over the 3 small faces in the crib. The room smelled of warm milk and clean linen, and the faint, sweet scent of beeswax candles. "He wrote to me," she said. The Duke looked at her. "What did he say?" "That he was sorry." There was a pause. Then, "And what do you feel?" She considered the question. Outside, the wind stirred the oaks. Inside, one of the boys sighed in his sleep, a small, contented sound that filled the room like music. "I feel," she said slowly, "like a woman who walked through fire and came out the other side. Not unburned, not unchanged, but whole." The Duke reached for her hand. He held it the way he always held it, firmly, steadily, as though he had no intention of ever letting go. "You are the strongest person I have ever known," he said. She smiled. "I am not strong. I was simply too stubborn to stay down." He smiled back. "Same thing." They sat together in the firelight, their hands clasped, their son sleeping, the house quiet around them. Outside, the September wind carried the last warmth of summer across the Somerset hills, and somewhere far away in a leaking house in Wiltshire, a man sat alone in the dark, holding a brandy glass he could no longer afford to fill, staring at the wall and understanding, finally, the cost of his pride. But here, in Glenmire Hall, there was peace, there was love, there was a woman who had been told she was nothing, and who had proved, beyond all argument, that she was everything. And there were 3 small boys, sleeping soundly, who would grow up knowing exactly how strong their mother was. And that, my friends, is the story. Thank you for being here. Every view, every comment, every subscription means the world to me. This community is growing, and it is because of you. If you enjoyed this story, share it with someone who needs a good escape. If it moved you, tell me your favorite moment in the comments. And if you have not subscribed yet, join us. I would love to have you here for the next story. Until next time, take care of yourselves. And remember, the people who try to make you feel small are always the ones who are afraid of how tall you might grow. I will see you soon.